Tansi, welcome to the Learning Lounge. Mahigan Niskoyo Sonesi Piknit Sigasan. My Cree name is Wolfwoman by the Running Water. My English name is Tara Million. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Indigenous Studies here at the University of Lethbridge. With me is my colleague. Can you please introduce yourself?
Thank you very much, Tara. My name is David Kootnikoff, and I'm an instructor in the English department here at the University of Lethbridge, where I teach creative writing, Indigenous literatures, and Canadian literature.
All right, and so today we're going to be talking about positionality and how we both use positionality assignments in our classes.
Yes.
So maybe we could start with discussing what positionality is.
Yeah.
And would you like to go first and say, you know, from your position or from your point of view, what is positionality?
Sure. Okay, so from my point of view, it's a way of being transparent as someone who teaches literature that I'm not directly related to, for example, Indigenous literatures. I'm not an Indigenous person, so it would be transparent to say that I come from a particular class or an ethnic background, and these are some of the cultural blind spots perhaps that I have when I introduce it. And then I ask my students to also participate in that same practice. And so it's transparency would be one of the ways that I would sort of like fundamentally, you know, define it.
Yeah, and it sounds like it's really related to ethics too, and being ethical.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So then for myself, positionality comes out of a lot of the ways that I was taught to behave growing up. And in community, elders will always say, who are you and where do you come from? And so those were the basic questions that I was always taught that I needed to answer. That as soon as I go into a community gathering or into a room, I need to go around the room and introduce myself to everybody and kind of tell them who I am. And so that's not just my name, but that's the community that I come from, or who my father is, who my grandparents are, who my mother is, things like that. So it's about then finding those relationships between each other. So then usually the person I'm introducing myself to will say, oh, I know somebody from, you know, so-and-so, or from such and such a place. And then say, oh yes, okay, I know that person. So then we develop our connections.
Wonderful.
And we know who we are in relationship to each other.
Right.
And so then for me, positionality in an academic sense is a little bit that same sense of being self-reflective, using reflexivity, and understanding who you are and what your point of view is and your biases and how you come at particular materials, so that then you can engage in a respectful way.
That's great. So when you put it that way, it makes me think, as a settler, it's quite different when I was growing up, because you know, whiteness is the de facto kind of, you know, place that we sort of reside, that it's invisible. So a lot of the times we don't really mention where we're from, because we can kind of universalize our experiences. So what this experience is like telling me and teaching me is that it really does matter. And when I travel abroad, I could find out that that's where it really does kind of matter a lot. Like, I'm a Canadian, I've come from this particular place, and my family comes from this place, and so on. The questions come hard and fast outside of Canada, typically. But things have changed, you know, and I think that settlers have to now understand that this is really important, defining where we come from and who we are. And it might, in some cases, go against the grain for some people still, you know.
I think that that's a really important thing that you're bringing up, which is that oftentimes, especially if we're part of the dominant group, or the group that's kind of the de facto norm, then we don't tend to think about who we are and how we approach the world, because it just appears to be right. And I mean, one of my backgrounds is in anthropology, which is very much about sort of cultural norms, and then having to look at engage with and look at another culture and immerse yourself in that and go through the culture shock of that, and then come back into your own culture. And so I think that positionality is, it's very much a part of taking all of those unconscious pieces of yourself and really bringing them into the light for yourself, and then figuring out how and when you're going to use them. Like, for instance, when I introduced us, I started off with Cree. I started off introducing myself with my Cree name. That's establishing positionality for me in a really important way. And yet it's not, I think also positionality is not always an in-your-face kind of let's jump up and down about it. It's very much a, this is kind of making explicit who you are and deciding when and where you're going to bring those things forward. And it's important, I think, for modeling that for students.
I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Good point.
So, all right, so let's move over to our next kind of topic, which is how do we use positionality in the classroom? So we both do assignments in classes that we've taught that are structured around positionality, which I think is actually, on reflection, I think that's actually a little bit unusual because oftentimes academics are encouraged to develop positionality statements or are encouraged to think about positionality in terms of their research and their publication. But oftentimes we don't create assignments in classes that we teach around that. So maybe could you share a little bit about how you created your positionality assignments and what they might look like?
Yeah, well, it kind of grew out of a sense of introducing myself first to the class and then introducing the students and then realizing that there wasn't enough being said, there wasn't enough being divulged because we were going to get into literature that was going to be challenging in a lot of respects, right? So I started to model that myself and I would start to talk about my Doukhobor heritage and what that meant growing up as a Doukhobor in British Columbia, as well as with settler mother, Anglo mother and father. But then I realized that the students didn't have a chance to take the stage and also talk about themselves. And so then I decided to develop an assignment which would motivate the students to try and do it. And I've noticed over the last 2 years that I've been teaching here at the university that there's a real difference between the first year courses that I teach in English literature and then the more third or fourth year courses, right? And creative writing as well. So I've met, certain students might have a little bit of resistance to it, not really kind of going deep enough for the assignment that I've tried to model and I've tried to sort of develop criteria for. So sometimes, and this is a minority usually, is that I would send it back to them and ask them deeper questions to sort of like talk a little bit more about this if you're comfortable, or write about this, because it's usually a writing exercise. So that's how I've approached it over the last 2 years, and getting to know you, I've seen how you've done it, and I've also learned from you, and I've applied your approach in many ways as well to the class. So how about you?
Well, I think in the beginning when I first started teaching, because I've taught at a number of different institutions over the years, and a lot of the time, the classes that I've taught have been fairly small, and they've been not on large campuses. So a number of the students have already known each other. And then it's very much more a discussion about, okay, well, let's introduce ourselves, tell me who you are, I can tell you who I am, so that then we can start to, create a relationship that will work so that we can learn together. And then as I've started teaching in larger institutions and with larger classes, so like here at ULethbridge and then also at the University of Saskatchewan, it really became apparent to me that students were coming from all over the place. That there were students who were local, there were students who had come internationally, there were students who were coming from other communities. So it was a really big mix of students and a much larger groups usually. And then the other thing too is now that I'm in Indigenous Studies, a lot of the topics that I teach are very difficult topics. So a lot of them have to do with colonization. They have to do with genocide, whether it's cultural genocide or physical genocide, residential schools, settler colonialism. And so that is really difficult for students to talk about and really address because it becomes very personal for them. Many of them have lived through that experience. They have family members who have lived through that experience, whether they're Indigenous or settler. And then as well, international students also really struggle with that material because they find it's such a shock to the way that they think about Canada.
Right. I know what you mean, right?
Yeah.
The international image of Canada. Wow.
Yes, that's
Different.
right. It does not align with the reality of colonization and the practices of colonization that happened in Canada, in North America, and throughout the world.
Right.
So in order to create a way for students to really engage with the materials, and my classes are always very discussion-based, I think just like yours, because there always has to be, students have to be able to talk about their understandings of the material. We're really looking for that kind of level of critical assessment and that ability to both understand but also analyze the materials that we're presenting them. So then, in order for students to feel comfortable talking about really difficult topics, I really started to realize that positionality was so important. And important enough that it needed to be pulled out of sort of the general participation mark that I give and moved into its own specific mark.
Right.
And I think that is a really important thing, is because students oftentimes assign the most importance to the things you're doing in the class based on the graded weight. Like how much percentage, and that is the reality of it. And so then to assign it its actual own weight.
Separate away from participation generally, right?
Yes, that's right.
I do the same.
So how do you find that, how much weight do you give to your assignments usually? And what do students think about that?
So I get the feedback that they really enjoy that exercise. It's about 10%, and it differs maybe 5% for one class, but usually 10% generally speaking. And but like you said, I mean, it's so important to weight it away from participation, because participation means showing up and engaging in discussions, whatever the case may be. But positionality is something separate and unto itself, and so by giving it that weight and that importance, I find is essential, and it does create really good results. Now, like I said, at first there might be a little bit of resistance, and this is really kind of minimal. Like most students have no problem doing it and engage with it, and I find like sometimes it's too much, right? They want to go on for pages and pages and pages about themselves. So the feedback that I've got before, just over the last couple of years, is that they've really enjoyed that, because they've got to know their colleagues in the classroom a lot better than just sort of like my hobbies and my future plans kind of as an introduction. This is, they drill down about who they are. So it creates a sense of community in the class. It facilitates that discussion that we were talking about. The trust is there, more established, more seriously. We understand that this person is a Métis, or this person's Blackfoot, Indigenous communities they come from, or that person's from Nigeria and they have some sort of experience with some religious conflict in their country, and we learn from each other and build community when we approach the material. It makes it, like you said, a lot more, I would say, thought-provoking, and the empathy then I think is at a more deeper level, I find in my classes.
So let's shift just for a second into kind of a little bit of an academic look at what we're doing, which is not just about kind of what we're doing, but also then why we're doing this. And you're starting to touch on that with your comments about building community in the classroom. I think that one of the things that both of us do in common in the classroom is really try to build a respectful space where everybody's voice can be heard, and where students do not feel pressured to all have the same view, to all come at the material the same way, and I think I'm going to go a little bit further and say neither of us come at it from a really authoritative stance, as in we have the best interpretation, and everybody has to go along with
That's
that,
right.
right?
Yeah, here's my book. You go read my book and you'll pass the course, right? No, not that way. We don't approach it that way.
No, yeah, because we're really trying to open up and
Yes.
engage and pull out people's ideas and then look at them,
For sure.
recognizing that everybody has their own analysis.
Yeah.
And so one of the things then that I certainly find happens in terms of creating that community is drawing on a lot of the ideas of Paulo Freire. And that he really talks about maintaining yourself. So in terms of whether you're an Indigenous person or a settler, whether you're colonized or a colonizer, or whatever your relationship with that may be, maintaining who you are as a person and as your positionality, but then being able to, from that, open up in dialogue a lot the way that we are doing across the table from our own positions, and be able to see the context of the ideas, what's being, the context of how the ideas are being created, the context of who is creating the ideas, what their biases are, what their purpose is, and really start to look at that critically in order to then not just react to ideas that get put on the table, but to jointly then create a critical consciousness where we're all looking at the ideas from our perspectives to really sort of assess them. Yeah, and then that opens up that ability to maintain who we are. And I think you talked about that a little bit when you were talking about the idea that as a settler, sort of, it was the universal experience. Do you want to talk a little bit?
Sure. I mean, I guess what you're referring to is that sense of comfort, entitlement, the sense of walking into a room and feeling like, oh, this is my place and I don't really have to worry about being critiqued or judged about where my positionalities come from. So I mean, that's how I grew up. I mean, from the middle class, white kid, White Rock, British Columbia. And so it really started to open my eyes when I went to university and I started to read Edward Said and Orientalism, and I started to realize, okay, there's a lot more to my world than I know and I appreciate. And so I was pretty young still, in my late teens, early 20s. And then when I started to travel, not only in Canada, because then I could start to see the prairies and I could see the East and I could understand, Indigenous cultures a little bit more. But when I left Canada, I often got a lot of questions about where I was from and what it was like. And I didn't always have good news about Canada being the peacekeeping nation, because I was aware of how Indigenous peoples were being treated. And so I would often bring that to the conversation in Japan where I was living, or in Hong Kong, and people were surprised to hear that. So that made me realize that, maybe back home we have to start to unpack this more in order to sort of create an international, I guess, representation of Canada that's more truthful and honest. And I guess I thought that we had to start with ourselves as settlers and look at that more carefully. So that's what I've started to do more and more in my professional life with my PhD. So I think when you talk about within an educational situation with Paulo Freire and talking about where we come from and always being comfortable with that, I still am comfortable with my settler identity, but I'm also acutely aware of the entitlement that comes along with that and the benefits that I've achieved because of that. And within the classroom, I'm very cognizant of creating situations where we're looking at material that challenges the status quo as I understand it. Something that we haven't talked about is, for me personally, is how this continues to change. It's not because I'm suddenly honest about myself and then I stop, growing. It's always things are being uncovered, and with every new book that I approach or I teach in the classroom, I learn new things about myself as well as my positionality. So I think that's how I would say, as a settler, coming around to this awareness, a lot of travel, opening up, reading different literature, and exposing ourselves to people like Edward Said and Paulo Freire. How about you?
I think as well that it's really, like you just really touched on something that I think is super important, which is that idea of change and how it continues to develop. So it's, for instance, we have, we each do positionality assignments. We've had a number of students in common, so they've had the experience of doing multiple positionality statements over the years with us. And I think that it's really important that they don't just create one statement and just do it over and over and over again. They even talk about in their statements how they have, how their understanding of themselves has shifted and changed, how their first one, their first positionality statement was kind of very a specific way, but then now they've started to refine it. And I think that that happens certainly with ourselves too. So that then a positionality assignment is not a static assignment either.
Not at all.
And it's also the kind of thing that students can do over and over and over again in multiple classes, and each time they will come to it differently. And they should. I mean, I'm thinking of a student that we've shared that didn't do that, that just reproduced the same statement that they had done in another class with me and reproduced it again in the other class. And I had to push back and say, you haven't read anything over the last year that's changed your thinking or challenged you in any way? And so that student had to go back and adjust a little bit for my particular assignment. So yes, absolutely. And ourselves too. That's right. Our understanding of ourselves and our own positionality really shifts and evolves. And becomes, because I think that's one of the things that's most important about positionality, is that it's complex. It's a little bit like identity in that sense. Like we can all say, well, here it is. This is my identity. This is my positionality. Here's my little box that it's in. But that's not reality. It is a complex, ever evolving and changing and shifting way of looking at the world and understanding your own self in it. And I think, for instance, my positionality when I was a teenager to when I was in my 30s to where I am now, and when I think forward to, you know, into the future, it's going to continue to change over time.
And I hope so for me personally, you know, that's an exciting thing. And there are challenges though. I mean, sometimes, you know, you get a little bit tired sometimes of always having to sort of like drill down with every new experience at times, right? So, you know, that's why we take summers off sometimes. Rejuvenate and travel.
And we reflect and think.
And we reflect and we journal and we do that.
Right. That's right.
It is exciting, but also we have to stick with it. We have to be vigilant.
I think one of the things that we haven't talked about yet is how positionality and positionality assignments in particular really relate to the larger picture of indigenization and reconciliation.
Oh yeah, we haven't talked about that.
And I think that that is something that's really exciting and important about positionality assignments too. With this larger societal shift since the TRC in 2015 and the recognition that, you know, we are a colonial country, and then a shift towards really seriously trying to indigenize and reconcile, which are two different things, but related. So how do you see positionality assignments kind of relating to that? Because our position, our creation of positionality as an actual graded assignment is coming in this context. And 20 years ago, we might have gotten administrative pushback in terms of these kinds of assignments.
That's interesting. So things have changed. They call it the reconciliation turn, right, in Canada. So in this context, I think that speaking from a settler's perspective, but also settler students and also foreign students, so leaving Indigenous students out for just a moment, I think it challenges the students in the first year especially to understand that they come at the material in a way that is kind of like a matter of fact for them. They sort of like, this is just the world as it is. And when they approach positionality and I model it and I then try to sort of develop it in the class, they realize that these are fluid and ever-changing aspects to the culture and to the literature. And I think that that helps them develop an empathetic approach to reconciliation, indigenization, helps them understand it on a deeper level, that we need to accept certain problems and mistakes and the genocide, the responsibility of addressing that in Canada within the context of the English classroom is essential, and it contributes to that empathy, and it contributes to a more open mind, in my experience. From an Indigenous perspective, I mean, all I can see is what I've observed from my Indigenous students in the class. And I can see that they feel more comfortable in the class when they are like listening to settlers and hearing what they're coming from, and understanding that they're grasping and trying to sort of like grapple with, I guess is the right word, not grasping, but grapple with the responsibilities of genocide within a colonial context. It makes them feel like, okay, so now we're getting to the brass tacks. You know, an Indigenous person might, and one of my students mentioned to me, we're talking seriously now about change, and we're not just talking about sort of window dressing. These people and these fellow students and colleagues of mine in the class are addressing this in a way that is a little bit more appropriate than I've been used to hearing it. So that's very satisfying when I hear that from an Indigenous perspective. So how about you?
Well, I think I'll start with my observations of Indigenous students, and from that, because that's the perspective that I'm coming from too, which is that oftentimes coming into a classroom and starting to learn academic materials, particularly academic materials that are about yourself, can be shocking. It really can raise a lot of feelings of anger, beyond anger, rage. It can enrage you to hear yourself talked about as a subject in classes. It can also, and again, beyond sadness, it's grief. It's terrible, terrible grief too, that you can start to feel. And these feelings can really become overwhelming. And I find that positionality and being able to talk about positionality gives Indigenous students the ability then to voice those feelings, to process and acknowledge them, and then to shift to thinking critically about the materials as well too.
Right.
And I think that also happens for settler students as well as for new immigrant students too, which is that sense they come at it from a slightly different emotional standpoint. I mean, we talk about white guilt. I see a lot of that in my classes, and I see a lot of students struggle with that. And I think then positionality is a way for people to acknowledge that, to voice that, to be heard, about their emotional responses, and then to integrate their emotional responses into their critical analysis of materials. And that's powerful.
It sure is.
If you can really get your heart and your head connected so that you are then able to focus on the materials and engage with them in that thoughtful, critical way. And feel that connection and that support of your colleagues and your peers in class, that can be a really, really powerful, I think, and profound classroom experience. And I mean, what you just said about the rage and the anger too, if I could just go back a little bit, I experienced that in one of my classes, you know, and it taught me in the moment that the way we approach literature from a settler perspective can sometimes be very reckless, and we have to be very careful about these stories. These are sacred stories when we're talking about Indigenous stories, right? And one of the Indigenous students voiced a very angry opinion about one of the settlers' opinions about a particular story. And I think that wouldn't have happened if we weren't really talking about positionality. I think there was an honesty that was there. The rage came out, the anger came out, but then on the settlers' part, they were able to sort of like walk back their critique, and then I was able to intervene a little bit and then put it into context that this is perhaps a different way that we have to approach
literature. We don't approach Virginia Woolf in the same way we might approach Eden Robinson, especially within a Canadian context, right?
Yeah.
And so I thought that was very useful. And so your point, that's so important. And then making that head to heart connection, right?
Yes.
And then analyzing the material, getting through that. Fantastic point. Yeah. Really good.
Well, I think I'm going to just wrap up for myself with
okay.
saying, because we're just about out of time.
Is that right?
This has
Time
been a
flies.
wonderful discussion,
it
though.
Sure has,
Yeah. So
Okay.
I think if I can summarize, is that for both of us then, using positionality assignments really creates a way for each individual student to have voice, to be able to be recognized in a respectful way, and to create a trusting and opening community in the classroom where we can work through a lot of the very difficult issues that come with attempting to reconcile and address our shared colonial history.
Wonderful.
Yes.
And
Would you like to add anything to wrap up?
I think the only other thing that I would say is that, we mandate it in a way, right? We make it 10% and we take it away, as we mentioned before. We make it, a standalone assignment. And I think that that's important too, because we require that as part of the syllabus. And to get through the class, you're going to have to do this positionality statement.
Yeah.
So I think that's important. We do make that part of the syllabus in our curriculum.
Yes. So we set the expectation, we set the structure, and then we open the way for the students to engage with it.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Oh, it's always good talking to you, Tara.
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah. I look forward to hearing more about what we're going to be doing in this coming year.
Yeah, me too. Thank you very much for joining us at the Learning Lounge.